Salm, company Messring GmbH. As the title already said, I'm going to talk a little bit about study we did last year, where we compared real children with CPD systems, with the surrogates, the dummies we use. And I think the most important piece, before we come to those results of that study, is to understand why we actually do this work and why Messring has been investing so much money in this. I'm a father and I have two children. And for me, that question is very easy answered. I get shivers down my spine if I see those numbers. Just let it sink in. 50 children dying each year of heatstroke in Mars. And the worst part is, only in the US there is a clear documentation and statistics on those heatstroke-related fatalities. All the other countries, basically that data is taken from Google and tabloid analysis. It's like screening Bild every day and saying, okay, was there a news alert about a child dying in the park? So that means the black number, the black digit is much, much higher. And I think that's very important when we talk about CPD and CPD systems to come to realize why we do it. We want to save lives, children lives. That's our motivator. We started early in 2021. At that time, you will probably all know, there weren't any CPD systems in cars in the market. And regulation was there in the future, but it wasn't implemented yet. At that time, we had a lot of workshops with our partners, and it was like testing, trying, we were trying, the partners were trying, and we very quickly got to a point where we had to take a fundamental decision. And the decision was, what philosophy do we follow in our surrogates? For us, it was very quickly clear we want to have a surrogate, a dummy, that is as close to a real child as possible. That means the skins, the reflections, no metal inside. A real child doesn't have metal inside. And that meant for us we have to work with a pneumatic system. The pneumatic system has other advantages because it much more realistic lets breathe even a dummy. You're much more able to fine-tune breathing, not only frequency, but of course the depth of breathing as well, and the speed of breathing. So that was a fundamental decision for us to say, okay, we need this platform strategy, and we're going to use pneumatic as our propulsion system. In 2022, basically we went on refining it, we were learning, we were working on the robustness of our system. We were also working with our partners, and every day or every week there were new sensors being tested as well. There was a lot of testing about single sensors, multiple sensors, combining different technologies together. So there was still a lot of testing and trying to be done, and I think in some areas we're still working on these testing and trying. In 2023, we were then at a point where we had a lot of workshops, as you can see, with a lot of data, and for us it was very clear that talking about a surrogate, you need to have a surrogate or a reflector according to the sensor being used. Because if you use, for example, UWE, it has a totally different performance than if you do radar 60 gigahertz. It's just a different performance of the sensor. So we needed different reflectors of our surrogates to mirror that. In 2024, with the knowledge we had from the last 3 years, we completed our family with the 6-year-old and the 3-year-old, and because we had based a lot of work in the years before on studies done in clinics and studies done by our partners, it was for us the time to say, okay, now we need to have a real scientific base. We didn't have a scientific base until then. The data being used in the market comes from clinics. It comes, I don't know, from internal-made studies, but basically there's never, or it has to be very clear that the environment where you use the sensor has a very strong influence on what you see and what you get back. So if you do a study in a clinic, it has a total different performance sensor than you do in a vehicle, for example. That was the point where we decided, okay, we need to go that way and do a study. I mentioned we have 3 dummies in the market now. Euro NCAP in the latest release on CPD said they're going to validate those dummies. We're in the process. We're trying to get there now. There aren't any certified dummies or surrogates in the market yet. That's not true. And if you look at the current regulation, basically there's a little bit about weight, there's about sizes. So we're complying with the ISO norm in the current Euro NCAP protocol. The newborn is able to breathe, and as I mentioned, because we use pneumatic air, you have different modes. You can adjust the breathing. Of course, you can have a standard frequency like Euro NCAP is proposing, but you can change that frequency and you can play around with the deepness of breathing. And that was something we learned, for example, in our study. We had some babies sleeping when they were in the car and outside, and then they woke up while we did the measurements. And it was phenomenal to see the change in frequency and depth of breathing. And that is something you can do with our newborn because we use the pneumatic system. The 3 and the 6-year-old have the movement of head, extremities, and breathing basically, so they're fully movable. And also, these movements are adjustable. So what we integrated is like standard mode, and then we have randomized mode. And the randomized mode means it's gonna change the frequency of the breathing, the depthness of the breathing, it's gonna change the movement of the arms or the hands. Basic goal is behind it. We don't want algorithms to learn what the CPD surrogate is doing, because then it's easy again for the algorithm to detect basically. So we want to make it as difficult as possible for the algorithm. I mentioned the pneumatic system, and pneumatic systems need space. So we have quite a nice control box with a pneumatic system in it. You only need that box if you're going to use the system in a mobile manner. There's a battery in it, and you can carry it around. You can take it outside and use it on the test ground. If you're inside your home, you have a pneumatic system installed and you have energy there, you can just plug that in and you don't need to use the box basically. The box of course can be in the trunk of the car or outside. So everything that is relevant for the sensor is metal free. Of course there is metal inside. And then you have air pipes going into the surrogate. Maybe one comment, because Euro NCAP is talking about the 1-year-old. One learning we have from our study is basically that you need the newborn sleeping, very, very little breathing, no other movements, and then you need a lot of movement. Everything in between, if you have those 2 barriers, well, you're going to detect everything in between as well, because it's just something put together in between. What we have in the 6-year-old, if you want to use the 6-year-old like a newborn, just with a bigger reflection body, you can tune the breathing just as low as it was a newborn. Not very realistic, the 6-year-old boys and girls have a different breathing, but you have the possibility if you really want to challenge your systems, for example. So yes, we have the 3-year-old as something in between, but really, if you have a system that detects a newborn and the 6-year-old with disturbing movement, you're fine. Now, as I mentioned, when we started, we based our information on clinical data, with from clinics and data from partners. And what we then learned is that the complexity around CPD testing and CPD development is overwhelming, and we need our own data. As I mentioned, we have different technologies using visual sensors, using weight sensors, heat sensors, radar sensors, UVB sensors. In our study, we had one partner using two sensors in the middle of the car. We have other partners using 4, 6, up to 8 sensors, and all that information has to get together. And it's different. It is very different from what you see in the picture of the surrogates. And of course, not only the sensor is relevant, much more relevant, what we've learned as well, is the algorithm lying behind the sensor. Do you have an algorithm which is focusing purely on breathing mechanisms? Or do you have an algorithm which takes any movement into account that there might be something living in the car? And you know much better than I do, you can increase the complexity as much fold as you want, basically. But it's very interesting to see different algorithms and how they receive and then compare things. That was basically the point in time where we said, okay, we really need that study to compare these different alternatives. We were then very proud to be able to work together with Messring University, Professor Pelchus, who was the scientific cadre of the study, basically. We were very thankful that Allianz gave us the neutral ground, which we could work in their whole unit. And we had Continental and Embedded AI as the two different sensor partners, basically. Messring is, of course, providing the surrogates. If we now think two partners, what complexities might there be between the two partners? Because of course there's a lot of knowledge in the algorithm and the system you use. A lot of knowledge of those companies. So what they didn't want is that they are on the ground doing the testing at the same time. So basically, we had the first 2.5 days of the week testing one partner with all 14 children, and we'll come to that in a minute. And then we had the next 2.5 days testing with the other partner, independently, no disturbance between the partners. Now, what is challenging about a study with real children? And the first, so the far left upper part, is the approval by the ethics committee. Now, we were asked often, why do you do that? Why do you take that step? Well, in Germany, if you do a study with vulnerable people, and children are vulnerable people, you need an ethics approval. Otherwise, you can be sued, civil or criminal court. This is no joking. This is law, basically. Do it without, you're unlawful. And you cannot publicize that information. So that is a long way to go. It took us 3/4 of a year. We do applications, the ethics committee has questions, coming back to you. So it takes a lot of time, but then you achieve. Second part, compliance with data, quality and security. GDPR is known to everyone, and here it's not so much, we try to normalize the data basically. Of course, the university is the only one who gets the data, or can link the data to people, and then you have to store that data. That's the big challenge here for 10 years, and the partners are not allowed to have direct access to that data and be able to route it back to a person that was taking part in this. Next one, recruitment of participants. I thought it would be easier when you talk about a topic like that, but there are a lot of mummies and daddies when you say, can we have your newborn and put it in a car? It's like, but there's sensors inside the car, they're already in the car, and it's nothing specific, and you have a mobile phone. But people get very, very cautious when it's about their kids. And then you need roughly 2 hours the children being tested, because you would test them at all the different scenes in the car. You would have them sitting outside from sensors being pointed at them from different angles. So each session was 2 hours. So people were very very cautious. I think we were in contact with 5 to 7 kindergartens and teachers, and in the end we were able, through our employer network, to acquire 14 children. So we had 5 newborns, we had 5 to 6-year-old, and 4 3 to 4-year-old kids. And maybe that's an interesting point as well. Of course, the age doesn't matter at all, because the sensor doesn't see age. So it's all about the size of those kids. We actually had a baby which was a baby. It was just half a year, but it was nearly as big as one of the 3-year-olds. So, and then we basically started to cluster more according to size and weight of the children instead of age. Partner acquisition and management, we were really lucky to acquire those partners as just just shown. But of course the management, it takes a couple of fix to get everybody online for that week and is everything prepared and everybody comes with their own car and is the team alright and nobody ill. And so yes, there's some resource necessary to do that. And then study duration management, I already mentioned. Just purely the ethics committee application took half a year and we got green lights there. And then a partner, just after we got green lights, asking if they could still join. But that takes you another 6 weeks to get a new partner adjusted. So we weren't able to take on a third partner. And of course, transferability of results is very important. Because yes, we did tests inside the vehicle and outside the vehicle, but it's 5 participants here, 4 there, 5 there. Can you talk about 100 or 1,000 kids? Is it all the same? So that's definitely something to be discussed about. These are just some pictures, and you see the far right was in cars, and then we had a special setup for testing outside the cars, where we had the surrogates all sitting there, and then we were measuring them from 7 different angles. Coming to results. This is the cluster newborn. Now how to read this? I'll give you a little bit of help here. Blue line surrogate, basically our dummy. And then we have the strongest newborn up here and the lowest newborn up here. Now one would say it's not very clear bandwidth you can see there. And that is basically because there is so much difference in the measurements between those kids as well. We also had one kid where he had a little T-shirt from the police station. There was some reflecting material on it, and when we did the test with the kid, it was like really like a grown-up. Like, what's the matter with this kid? Until we took off the T-shirt, because we had standard clothes actually, but we just put it over the T-shirt, and so we took off the T-shirt, measured again, and he was basically in the bandwidth. So what we see here is, from our perspective, we're right there in the middle. I would be happier if we would be a little bit lower. Yeah. So we make sure that we detect all children, or the system detects all children. You don't want to be too low, because then of course you would get a lot of false positives maybe. Yeah? If your system is too sensible, you have to be careful not to be too low. So you really want to be very close to the bandwidth. This is the 3 years old, and now an interesting discussion is how much difference is still acceptable or not acceptable. Now what we define is the difference we have in the bandwidth between the kids, roughly in the same cluster, that is also acceptable as the difference to our surrogate or dummy. But that is something to be discussed, of course. The next question is, are all degrees, is it all relevant? 90 degrees, 0 degrees, sensor directly pointing at me, up to 90 degrees to the right or to the left. And that question clearly is yes, all degrees, all angles are absolutely relevant, because it depends on the number of sensors you have in the car and the allocation of those sensors. Think about cabriolet, you can't have a sensor in the top or in the middle, so you need all angles. Here we have the 6-year-old for me, one of the nicest raps actually, and basically there we can also say that if you use the newborn, the 3-year-old, or the 6-year-old of Messring, you can be sure that with those sensors we are spot on. They're not over reflecting, they're not too strong, they're just right in the language that you need it to have proof that it is representing a real child. Discussion. As I mentioned, influence inside, outside class. Those measurements were all outside the car to eliminate the influence of the car. What we see between the two partners, they had different cars, different pictures, not different pictures. So the key is outside, and also, I forgot to mention, without movement. So the kids they needed to sit still. We had an iPad with Paw Patrol looking at them, so they weren't moving too much. Because movement, of course, distorts the whole graph. Limited number of children, 2 partners with different hardware setups. We would have been very happy to have more partners, but as I mentioned, the whole duration, the cost, we weren't able to get more into the project. Now I'm over time. Do we have a question time for a question? If there's one question or something, back through. So thank you very much for your attention. You're ready to go to lunch, or you have a question? Question? Anyone has a question? Impressions? Then I let you go to lunch. Thank you very much.